Maybe building right on that opening prayer, I want to say that one of the bases for Paul's authority is not the usual form of I have authority by reason of some institutional character or ordination or formal role, but it's more the authority of his lifestyle. And that's why he dares to say what he just said there in that prayer, imitate me. It's not dominative power, it's imitative power. Because I'm doing it, just come with me. It's a wonderful kind of leadership when you can invite people into what you already believe and what you're already doing. And it's a different kind of authority than merely institutional authority. I think it's what we mean by true charismatic authority. And in the classic meaning of the term, Paul is a very charismatic leader. He's not a priest. He's not a formal rabbi. He's not ordained in our later sense. Even the institutional church never says there's any claim that he was a priest, although I doubt if the 12 apostles thought of themselves as priests either. He's a man with an experience. And what we're going to try to do this week, we're going to try to unpackage that experience, which you'll see is the pivotal experience. If you understand what we call his conversion experience, or his call, all of his major themes are contained in seed form in what apparently he experiences. We're talking about this timely period. 2 days from now is the feast of the conversion of St. Paul. And I think, as far as I know, it's the only feast day in the whole church year that precisely commemorates a conversion, a transformation, because his transformation was so absolute and had such unbelievable implications for Christianity. As we said last week, many would say he is the real founder of Christianity. And that always shocks people when you say that. But I hope you can see how in many ways it's really true. He takes the message of Jesus, and I know this has a bad connotation to most people, but he institutionalizes it. He theologizes about it. He's also called the first Christian theologian, who takes the experience and moves it into the head to try to make some coherent patterns out of his experience. Now, as I said recently in that article in Radical Grace on Epiphany, an experience is different than an idea. D.H. Lawrence said this. He said, an idea you can do whatever you want with, but an experience does something with you. You can reformulate, rethink an idea, but an experience rethinks you and changes you. Now remember, that was a definition of what it meant to be an apostle. You had to have seen with your eyes Christ risen from the dead. And if you could give that first-hand testimony, that made you a witness and made you an apostle. Even though he was not one of the 12 apostles, he claims he had the experience. That I saw him with my own eyes, and therefore I am an apostle. He never backs off. So Paul's authority is based, first of all, as I've said now a number of times, an experience, not an ordination. What does this say about the authority of the church? And most of you in this room, I assume, are not ordained. Right? Paul takes his authority to speak the truth, not because he went to through a seminary program, but because he had an experience of Christ. Secondly, Paul's authority is based on a personal call, not an institutional call. This is getting scary, at least by normal denominational concerns. He, in fact, goes out of his way to say, Peter, James, and John have nothing to do with my authority. I'm pretty arrogant, really. He's saying, I'm standing here my own man. He's got courage. I was about to use another word, but I won't use it in polite company. Right? He also goes on to say that his suffering, having walked the talk, now he'll say this in his later letters after he suffered for many years, this is what really gives him his authority, that he's done it, that he's walked through the mystery of death and resurrection with Christ, and now he knows for himself that resurrection follows death. It's no longer simply the Jesus experience, now it has become his experience. There's something, brothers and sisters, you can only know by dying and coming out the other side. Not bitter, not hateful, not vengeful, but in fact with a new quality of life. That transformation process is called the Paschal Mystery and is the central mystery of Christianity. We Catholics put it at the center of every Eucharist. We say to the people of God, let's hear the mystery of faith. And you say, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. The mystery of death turning into resurrection is the primary, and you could almost say the only work of God. That's God's job description. What we crucify, God raises up. What we kill, God transforms. What we destroy, God makes new. One of Paul's greatest lines is, there's only one thing that matters, and that is to become a new creation. Not circumcision, not the laws, not ritual practice, not dietary obligations. Only one thing matters. Have you become a new creation? Our term is, have you been transformed? His authority is based, therefore, on experience, personal call, his personal suffering, and, as I mentioned very quickly at the beginning, his ability to ask you and his communities to imitate him. Not his power to dominate you, but his power to say, follow me. And he's often using that phrase, saying, imitate me as I imitate Christ. That takes courage. I'd be afraid to say that, because I do too many lousy things that I wouldn't want you to imitate, you see. But he says, no, imitate me. He has got courage, this guy. And I know you're saying arrogance and self-confidence, but it's really daring. Where does that kind of daring come from? I suppose if I saw with my human eye, right, a light and a Jesus apparition like you, I would know something and have that kind of self-confidence. That's the only thing I can attribute this absolute daring, almost reckless self-confidence of St. Paul, that I believe he had to have had an extraordinary experience. And that's why I'm saying it's the pivotal event. What I'm going to try to do tonight is give you a little bit of theology, psychology of conversion. This might take probably the rest of the time. I want to show how all of his major themes come from this conversion experience. But first, I want to describe for you a little better what we mean by a conversion experience, at least biblically speaking. And in the history of the mystics, too, because I do think Paul is a mystic. And it's a mystical conversion he has, not a moral conversion. He's not saying, I used to be a bad guy, I was in drugs, sex, and rock and roll, and now I'm not. That's a moral conversion. That's the kind of hear at the jail. They're fine, but they tend not to last, and pretty soon you're back on drugs, sex, and rock and roll if you haven't had the mystical communion experience. First of all, it is an experience, not an idea, not hearsay, not secondhand information. There is no vicarious experience. We used to say God has no grandchildren. God only has children. In other words, every generation has to come to the experience for themselves. And I don't think we Catholics have often been told that. We somehow thought it was just fine to ride on Grandma's coattails. Grandma was Catholic, so I'm a Catholic, What do you know? What have you experienced? And very often there's no experience. It's simply civil religion. It's religion that we're all Catholics here in the South Valley of Albuquerque, aren't we? That's not going to suffice anymore. The prejudices against Christianity, the kind of pressure against belief is so major in our secular society that I think civil religion has been dying for the last 50 years and will probably continue to die. And maybe deserves to die, because it isn't really what Jesus is talking about, that you're just a Christian because your mother was. Until you've had some kind of parting of the veil experience where you can say, I know, right? you haven't been prepared for transformation. After conversion, one does not look at reality. Now, I'm going to play with words, but listen to me closely. One does not look out at reality, but you look out from reality. In other words, it's not over there. You're in the middle of it. It's a basic change in position and perspective. I've quoted that line so often of the Trappist monk when I was in the Hermitage who was in a deeper hermitage himself, and he told me, he says, I never get to preach, Richard, but you get to preach. And he says, when you do, just keep telling the people God is not out there. Thank you. And he went on down the road. I just followed his request, and I just told you, God is not out there. But before conversion, you tend to think God is out there. After transformation, God is not out there. You don't look at reality, you look from reality. You're in the middle of it now. You're a part of it. That's why I want to call this whole thing a mystery of participation. We're going to see that Paul is obsessed with this idea of I'm participating in something. I'm not writing the story. I'm a character inside of a story that's already being written. Brothers and sisters, that changes everything of how you see your life. If you think you're writing the story, you've got to do it right. You've got to be clever. You've got to figure it out. And if anything goes wrong, you've got yourself to blame. Right? It's a terrible way to live, even though a high degree of Christians do. And I would call it bad news. The good news is a completely different experience of life. You don't have to write the story. It's being written. I am already a character on the stage. I am being used. I am being chosen. I am being led. You will know that after conversion. You will know you're being used. And you'll know you're being led. And you'll know that your life is not all about you, but you're about life. You're an instance of this mystery of the agony and the ecstasy of God that is happening inside of you, and all you can do is say yes to it. That's all. That's sacred space. That's a converted person. And in light of that, you wonder how many converted people we have? And most of us are still living in profane space, trying to figure it all out and do it right and blaming ourselves every other day. No wonder we have so many people with negative self-images. In sacred space, it's not about doing it right. It's just about doing it. Did you know that? And that changes everything. Let me say it again. It's not about doing it right. It's just about doing it and listening to it and knowing that your life is not about you, that you're being used, that you're an instrument. Therefore, it's not self-consciousness after conversion as much as it is what the mystics call pure consciousness. See, self-consciousness applies, there's a dualistic split. There's me over here thinking about that over there. And the mind always remains dualistic until you've had mystical experience. Then the split is erased. The subject-object split, as we describe it. The split is overcome, at least for a while. You can't maintain it forever in primary consciousness. But you know it. And once you know it, you'll never be satisfied with anything less. Now, you all had a taste of it when you first fell in love. I hope you first fell in love somewhere. Right? When you first forgot about yourself and lived through another. When you first had a baby and just your whole life was totally concerned with that baby. And I see it in so many young mothers. I see it in airports and airplanes. I see it in my nieces after I go home and they've had their first baby. In 6 months, they move from giggly teenage girls to women, you know? Because for once, their center is outside themselves. And that's what happens in unitive experience. You don't become self-conscious as such, but you're freed from this burden of self-consciousness. And you can finally live in and through and with another. That's the experience of being in love, of falling in love. Now, ironically, I'm going to talk paradoxically, this doesn't destroy your sense of self. Ironically, paradoxically, it increases it. Do you remember? The only thing I can go back to is when you first fell in love. That first ecstatic thing as a teenager, probably. I hope you didn't wait much longer than that, you know? And it was probably puppy love. That's okay. It doesn't matter. But I'm not going to speak from the male side, but you never felt more a man. You never felt more a person, more alive. And it's precisely when you've lost yourself. You've given yourself away to another person, and you feel more a self than you ever were before. True union does not absorb distinction, but actually intensifies distinction. The more one gives oneself in creative union with the other, the more one becomes oneself. That's already mirrored in the doctrine of the Trinity. Perfect giving and perfect receiving between three, and they are all utterly themselves. The more one becomes oneself, the more capable we are of not overprotecting our false boundaries. You don't have anything to protect afterwards. And that's the great freedom and the great happiness you see in converted people. There's no little self here, you understand? No little self here that I've got to protect. There's no little self here that you've got to like or offer incense to. Because it's precisely that little self that I thought I was that has passed away. Now, Paul has the greatest one-liner of all to describe himself after conversion. I live no longer, not I. Live no longer, not I. That's a converted person. Ken Wilber is one of the great geniuses on the American scene, trying to really analyze religion. According to Ken Wilber, religion has always had two functions. The first function he calls a horizontal function. It gives the private self, the self that you are, Bill or Mary or Joe, it gives you a sense of meaning and purpose by holy stories and holy rituals and holy practices, and that's very good and very necessary. And you have to start there. There's no other place you can start with that first function of religion, the horizontal function that gives meaning to the private self. Got it? The trouble is, most people stay right there. Religion also has a secondary function. And I'm going to call this the vertical function. This, according to Ken Wilber, and it fits my experience, he says, it's a minority of every religion who allow it to happen to them. This does not console the separate self, but utterly subverts it. This function of religion does not affirm and tell you how good you are and how right you are and how perfect you are and how saved you are and how born again you are, all those things that people want from the first function of religion. But in fact, I'm going to use a bad word, it tells you you're full of shit. It tells you you're only a little creation that came along a few years ago. In the self-same moment, conversion tells you you're not worthy at all. And so we're settling that question here with all of you tonight. And I don't want you to waste another moment of your life asking this useless question, whether you're worthy. Okay, we're all agreed, as you leave here tonight, you're all knowing you're not. Don't waste any more time trying to get worthy. All right? Don't even go down the worthiness road. It is a waste of time. Tell me what the cutoff point, when you pass, what is it? When you pass from unworthiness to worthiness? When you go to 5 masses? When you obey all 10 commandments? When you become the Pope? Is the Pope worthy now? There's no cutoff point. Huh? So we've settled that. You've all agreed. You're unworthy. Now I'm going to talk out of the other side of my mouth. And this experience comes simultaneously. You're totally worthy. You have a worthiness that is your deepest you. And you know what? You can't gain it and you can't lose it because you already got it. And the word for that is you are sons and daughters of God. And that's inherent. And the only difference in this room is between those of you who know it and those of you who don't. Not between those of you who are worthy of it and those of you who are unworthy of it. You're all unworthy of it. Now, when you can hold together in the self-same moment the experience of absolute unworthiness, you're just a little shit. Good, I'm glad you can laugh at that. Some of you didn't, however. I don't think you're convinced yet. and you're perfectly worthy. Those can both be true at the same time. That's a converted person. Those are the most free and happy people you'll ever meet. They got it all. They're home free. There's nothing to wait for. You don't go to heaven, you become heaven. You don't go to hell, you become hell. And it's happening now. And that's why the saints said no one will be surprised. Religious conversion leads to a kind of universal relatedness, a kind of connecting at all points, a kind of universal compassion, really. That you delight in being one of these human beings. The smaller distinctions don't mean a great deal anymore. As I said, you're happy to say God bless America, but what comes more easily to your mouth is God bless humanity. Right? You're a part of the universal pattern now, and the smaller patterns aren't quite so important anymore. The smaller configurations are not your primary identity. You're now in the great big picture. You're now a part of the great big pattern. Abraham Heschel, the great Jewish mystic, his description for this conversion is what he calls radical amazement. It leads people to a kind of awe before everything. You get excited about a little pansy, It's enough to just turn you on. I remember a few months ago, I was over here at Kmart, and I don't know, I had a especially good day, but I found myself smiling at the Tide boxes. I don't know, standing there, no one else was on. And then I asked myself, what are you happy about, Richard? I don't know, but it's just, I know it's all okay. Awe before everything. It's like Albert Einstein said it so well. He said, either everything's a miracle or nothing's a miracle. There's no in between. Now, after conversion, everything's a miracle. What the burden of secular society is, nothing's a miracle. Nothing. And if anything tries to show itself as miraculous, it dismisses it. After conversion, the right brain opens up, and symbols and images and poetry, everything becomes symbolic and starts speaking to you. Ask for that, wait for that, seek that. After conversion, you're easily able to be self-critical, as we're going to see in Paul, without being self-hating. There's a difference. You can still admit your faults. And you can see, I really did that wrong, and I've got some real personality weaknesses, which I haven't been able to change. But you're not beating up on yourself anymore when you do it. Because you've now got the security to be insecure. You're living in the true self of who you are in God. That's the second function of religion, which somehow undercuts that smaller sense of self that we think we are, and inserts you into the bigger self that we would call the Christ self. That's what Paul would call it. His phrase for that is en Christo, to be in Christ. It's the most common phrase he has in all of his letters. It's the description of the transformed person after they've let go of the small self and are now living in the new self. The Buddhists are describing the same thing. They call the small self the ego self, and the transformed one the Buddha self. But it's a different sense of the self. I cannot say that strong enough. And the way you can tell, if you want the giveaway, that you're still living in the old self, is how often you take offense. How often you're upset. Because it's only the false self that easily gets upset. The true self just isn't that offendable. You can't hurt it. But the false self, it needs you to kiss up to it, or it needs you to praise it and offer it incense and show it special dignity, and it needs fancy clothes to think it's okay. The true self doesn't need any of those things. Heart and head tend to work together much better after conversion. You use your head, but after conversion, I'm going to use a metaphor here, but maybe it'll help you remember it. You'll know that rational knowledge has a ceiling to it. and that you've been led through the hole in the ceiling. You use your mind, but it has limitations. The great things cannot be explained by the mind. And the heart world, and I know that sounds sentimental, but it's much bigger. Spiritual consciousness is much larger than rational consciousness. So you still use your head like Paul does, but he's never limited to his head. Now people who haven't had religious experience, they don't understand that. And they can't understand that. They think you're making it up. You understand? Or they think you're just sentimental. Or they think you're, I don't know what they think. But until you pass through the hole in the ceiling, which is the precise work of God, it's usually imaged by a dove coming down or something like that in metaphor. But somehow the smaller scaled world has to disappoint you, has to fail you, has to fall apart for the larger world very often to reveal itself. After conversion, there's an increased capacity for happiness, for silence, for solitude. Why? Because there's a kind of self-sufficiency here. I don't need other people constantly to be around me to tell me I'm alive. Right? I don't need other people to make me feel content. Before that, you need reassurance almost every 5 minutes. Right? That stimulation is what makes me happy or makes me alive. Now there's an experience of inner aliveness, and so the outer aliveness is not nearly as important. After conversion, there's a childlikeness. We're going to see that. Paul calls himself a fool for Christ. There's a playfulness about you. You can laugh at yourself and you can laugh at life. As arrogant as he is, we're going to see he's also playful. There's just a tremendous increased freedom. Why? Because the big question is answered. You see, you're already on home base. That basic anxiety that most people live with, what if I'm not okay, has been answered. You've been legitimated and validated at the deepest level of your experience. And God has told you, you are okay. You are his son, his daughter, as we put it. And once you can believe that, you're home free. The hardest thing we'll ever do is to accept being accepted. Very, very difficult for human beings to accept being accepted. Let me pull it together like this. I think, brothers and sisters, you only will ever love a God who loves you. Why would you love when you have a friend of God? And you love God the way you let God love you. And finally, you love all of life and all of reality and yourself and other people the way you let God love you. So we're going to see how Paul let God love him. And the way Paul lets God love him is finally the way he loves him. Now that doesn't mean his humanity isn't still there. His mistakes still break through, just like yours and mine do. But be patient with him and see constantly breaking through this larger than life man who's not afraid of anybody, who knows who he is, and who's willing to believe that his experience is enough to change the world. Even though by the time he dies, there might be only several hundred people in the whole huge Roman Empire. Imagine going into the great city of Rome, seeing the hordes of people of all kinds of religions coming in all directions, and yet Paul is absolutely certain he's got the answer for it. And that he's going to change it. And the amazing thing is, in certain sense, he did. Thank you, and we'll see you next week. God bless you.